Welcome to the Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Matthews. This is a podcast where we journey from forest soundscapes to fragile oceans, from the complexity of development to the art of resistance, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining our futures. This episode is a conversation with Sunil Amrith, historian and writer. He is professor of history at Yale University, and the book we discussed in this episode is Unruly Waters: How Mountain Rivers and Monsoons Have Shaped South Asia's History, published in 2018. The book is a riveting read and filled with such a treasure trove of ideas, as was the conversation with him. As prelude, please note that from Asia's mountain core flow 10 great rivers that serve a fifth of humanity, that runs through 16 countries. The struggle for water in modern history is a global story, but nowhere has the search for water shaped or sustained as much human life as in India and China, a history where the control of water was pivotal. Unruly Waters tells the story of how the schemes of empire builders, the visions of freedom fighters, the design of engineers, and the cumulative dispersed actions of hundreds of millions of people across generations have transformed Asia's waters over the past 200 years. In that time, the quality as well as the quantity of water is under strain from a multiplicity of new demands and uses. With rising sea levels, deeply contaminated and shrinking groundwater, yet we continue to subjugate our rivers through building big dams and depend on artificial irrigation for our farming. In this conversation, we speak about the monsoon, the thread that runs through this book, and a range of other topics. I learned a great deal from him and hope you do so too. Sunil, welcome to the Subverse. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Let's get stuck in. In 2018, you published a wonderful book called Unruly Waters: How Mountain Rivers and Monsoons Have Shaped South Asia's History. In this book, you start by describing a NASA satellite image of the Himalayas, fringed by the iridescent lakes of the Tibetan Plateau. So massive are the mountains, so heavy is their concentration of snow, ice, heat, and melting water that they shape Earth's climate. And Asia's great rivers are a product of this geological history. Can you tell us more about this picture and what started you off on writing this absolutely riveting book? What sort of also led you to explore these unruly waters and their history? And is there maybe a more personal journey of water which also spurred you on?
Thank you so much, Susan. That picture came fairly late in the process, in the sense that I decided to start with it, I think, when I'd pretty much written the book. And it came out of my ongoing struggle to just comprehend the scale of the Himalayan waters and everything that flows from that, in the sense of the human consequences of what has often been called Asia's water tower or the third pole. And of course, that satellite image as a snapshot gives us a sense of how vast the mountain rivers are. But it also is, of course, a very partial and particular kind of view. And I think I end that section of the book by saying, of course, there are no people in it. And I should add, there are no animals in it. There's very little life in it. It's very much a sort of a view from above. And I suppose the whole book, in a sense, was playing with that scale of the kind of top down and the ground up, or the water up, perhaps. And so that image was also part of me figuring out that while we take for granted now, perhaps, that we understand the scale of the water-related problems that India and most countries in the region face, I also realized the scale of that problem actually becomes visible fairly late on. You know, it takes aerial photographs and then satellite images to allow us to picture it in that way, though of course the scale has been pictured in other ways, through mythology, through legends, through local knowledge of various kinds for a much longer period of time. So it felt to me, just to sort of finish on that image, that opened some of the questions that I wanted the book to tackle, but also drew our attention to the contradictions embedded in even thinking on that scale. Because we miss a lot as soon as we think on that scale, I think. In terms of my own journey to this, there's an academic journey and a personal journey that also come to be intertwined over the course of this. The book I wrote before this one was called Crossing the Bay of Bengal. And that book was really a labor of love for me. It was a book about migration. It was a book about the movement of people between India and Southeast Asia. And that had led me to spend a lot of time in coastal cities. Some of these were smaller towns in Tamil Nadu, places that used to be major ports that then, in a sense, declined, that are now once again at sort of hotbeds of port construction and infrastructure development, places like Nagapattinam, Kadalur, which I was interested in because so many migrants moved from these places to Southeast Asia. And it was spending time in coastal India, but also on the other side of the Bay of Bengal, coastal places in Southeast Asia, over several years. I mean, this was sort of an extended period of research that I was doing. I found it unavoidable, inescapable to start thinking about water more broadly, not just as a space to be crossed by migrants in the past, but really as an existential source of risk. I was doing my research just a few years after the Great Tsunami of 2004, where the scars of that were still very visible, and there were still many rehabilitation projects that were ongoing at that point. A general shared sense, both by meteorologists, but also by fishing communities, local people I spoke to, that there was an increase in extremes, that the storm surges were getting bigger, that in a sense coastal erosion, which was not just a result of rising sea levels, but in fact even more than that, of infrastructure development, port construction, of dredging and all of that, was fundamentally shifting the landscape. So I found myself increasingly drawn to that story, which isn't what had taken me there in the first place. I'd actually gone there really to look for traces of what seemed initially to me to be a vanished past. I mean, I was struck by the fact, for example, that you could walk around and there's very little to tell you that this was a place from which literally hundreds of thousands of people boarded these steamships in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It was one of the great migration ports of the world, really. Great emigration ports of the world. And I was initially struck by the fact that that history is almost invisible in the landscape. There's no museum, no monument, very little. But I realized that actually thinking only about that had blinkered me initially to a lot that was very interesting and very worrying that was going on right as I was doing that work. And so initially this project was about the coast. It was about the rising sea levels. It was about shifting storm activity. And eventually, inevitably, I realized, you can't think about the coast without thinking about the rivers as well. And so this was a journey upriver for me conceptually, but also in some cases literally. And that's what led me to, I suppose, a much bigger scale of writing than I initially thought I was embarking on.
I find that fascinating, a journey upriver. That's, I think, a nice way to put it. And it's sort of interesting that when you say that you started the whole idea of this book with talking about the coast, because when you read the book, at least initially, it's not obvious because it starts in the Himalayas, etc. But what I find fascinating is how interconnected all of this is. And, and this is something that really runs through your book, which is that you sort of move between the oceans and the rivers and the mountains, and how all these scapes are sort of connected existentially and literally in the continent. I also like what you said about Nagapattinam and how traces of history have vanished in some of these places. And this brings me to the next question, which is really how the kind of history that you write in your book, which is in a way sort of moves away from, let's say, more dominant writings of environmental history. And I'd like you to speak a little bit more about that. And what were the conscious things that you had to do to move away from those narratives?
So for me, I suppose one of the discoveries, as I was just saying, was environmental history itself. I didn't start out as an environmental historian. I started out with a number of the interests that I still have. It's just that I've increasingly seen the environment as central to those interests. Those interests are explaining the historical origins of inequality, of the inequalities that continue to shape South Asia and the wider world. And so this project that started me thinking about all of this was really about migration, and specifically about the migration of labor. The environment didn't come into it at all. And I suppose it became at some point unavoidable. And I know that I'm not alone in having that experience. I think there are so many fellow scholars, fellow historians who work on all regions of the world who never started out as environmental historians, even if as citizens they have been increasingly concerned about the multiple environmental crises we all face. And I think a number of us have seen those things coming together, which is to say that, our work eventually and maybe inevitably comes up against what we as individuals, as citizens, have already been concerned about in terms of the where we're going in the present and looking to the future. So for me, that led to a steep learning curve. The field of environmental history is rich and vibrant. It is also quite young compared with many other fields of history. There's been an extraordinary amount of and diversity of environmental historical scholarship. India has been really at the heart of this since the 1980s. So too has the US and some parts of Europe as well. But, I would say that there's a distinctive tradition of Indian environmental history going back to the 1980s that is inspiring not just to those who work on South Asia, but far beyond that. And yet it is a relatively young field. I mean, we're talking about a field that's developed since the 1970s or the 1980s. And in that sense, I don't think it is yet mainstream. Which is to say, if you walk into a bookshop and you look at not even necessarily the bestseller lists in history, that's a slightly different thing. If you just look at the collection of history that's being written, if you look even at a publisher's catalog, I would still say that you would see environmental history as far from dominant. I think it's much more likely that you will find political histories of nationalism, histories of particular communities, sort of identity-based histories. And, I think a fair way down that list, though rising up the list, I think would be environmental history. So I feel like that's also what makes the field so exciting. I think it's a field in formation. It's a field without a dominant perspective. It's one where lots and lots of different approaches coexist. And I think one of the other enticing things about the field for me as a scholar, and I think for most of my colleagues who work on this area, is that it has to be interdisciplinary. You can't write environmental history, I think, without engaging with, for a start, environmental science, but with many other fields as well. Anthropology, I think, is another really important point of intersection between environmental history. Many leading environmental historians are, in a sense, hybrid of a historian and an anthropologist. To be true of my colleague at Yale, K. Shivaramakrishnan, who's one of the real pioneers of the field in South Asia, for example.
I totally agree. I think it's the interdisciplinary nature of the book which really caught my attention. And I also love the storytelling, that you've peppered the book with so many of these stories, especially stories of empire and kind of these more personal narratives of certain engineers or certain historians. I think that really comes through in the book. It's wonderful. Maybe we can start talking about some of the things that appear in the book. And I'm going to start actually with the monsoon, because that seems to play such a central role in the book, in people's imagination in India, at least. I come from Kerala, and I still have memories, of being a child and being in our house, my grandfather's house. And I was just sort of sitting in the veranda and just watching the rain. It's really quite incredible to be able to describe that rain to people who haven't seen it or heard it. It's really quite a force of nature. So I'd love for you to talk more about the monsoon and, the role it plays in your book and the role it plays in our history, and also, I think, in our coming futures.
Thank you for that, Susan. I love that you just talked about the sound of the monsoon as well as the sensation of it, because it's so enveloping, it's so all-encompassing, and it can be difficult, I think, to capture that in prose. I mean, it may well be that filmmakers are better suited to doing that than writers, just because you can at least get a couple of more of the senses in the sort of the visual and the oral. There's a wonderful project that the architect Lindsay Bremner organized over a number of years, and they had a great exhibition, a virtual exhibition because of COVID last year, Monsoon Assemblages. Is a multimedia project on the monsoon. She took a number of cities, the team took a number of cities, Chennai, Yangon, Dhaka, and using short videos as well as a lot of visual material, photographs, drawings, plus, archival historical research, I felt that they really did a very nice job of capturing just the rhythms of the monsoon, how they shape everyday life. So I completely agree that it is just such a distinctive part of daily experience, particularly in certain parts of India. And I think Kerala is probably quite high on the list of places sort of most dramatically shaped by the monsoon in terms of the rhythms of life. And here's the puzzle. Read most works of Indian history written since the 1970s, and it's not there. It's there in the older agrarian histories. It's certainly there. It's there, in fact, in a beautiful way, in a way that I found very inspiring in the earlier agrarian histories of India that have been written in the 1960s and 70s. And then it sort of disappears. It's nowhere, for example, in the brilliant school of subaltern studies, which is in so many ways has been so profoundly influential to me and to everybody else who writes Indian history. It's nowhere in a lot of the cultural histories that were being written in the 1980s and 1990s, which primarily focused on questions of identity. And I just felt there was a disconnect between this, as you put it, this force, this utterly life-giving and often life-destroying force that is in everybody's consciousness, that is in everybody's memories, that is there even as backdrop in cinema, in music, in everything. And so the question was, how can we bring this into the history writing, but in a way that's not sort of romanticizing? Because of course this other tradition of writing about the monsoon that's very exoticizing, that's very going back to colonial times, but there's a thread of that goes through the 20th century that's very much about this is what makes India alien, it's what makes India different from the West, from temperate climates. I certainly had no interest in doing anything like that. So the question was really, can we write a history of India that is attentive to all of the things which I and so many others in the field are interested in, which is poverty and inequality, that struggles for power, but which doesn't ignore this fundamental environmental natural phenomenon. So that's why it's central, and I completely agree with you. I think, if I was asked in one sentence what this book was about, it's about the monsoon. It is about the rivers, it's about water more generally, but more than anything, it's about the monsoon. And I think there's a number of different histories of the monsoon that come into it. When I was writing the book, I was asked by a very hard-headed social scientist, I told him what I was writing, he said, does the monsoon need a history? And I think it actually has three kinds of history that come out of this book, and of course, all of the work that I found very helpful and inspiring in writing it. The first thing is that it has a natural history. And what's really striking is that natural history has become legible to climate scientists and paleoclimatologists in quite a dramatic way just over the last decade or so because of new technologies and new ways of thinking about climate data. So what we know is that the monsoon has never been stable, that it's had these cycles of sometimes quite abrupt and sometimes quite intensive change over decades, over centuries, over millennia. So in a sense, the monsoon has always been this dynamic object. And yet we know that the changes that have been brought about by human activity, by anthropogenic change, above all by planetary warming, have been at a pace and on a scale that is not quite paralleled in the sort of natural record of variability. So in a sense, there are two things that we need to remember at the same time. One is that the monsoon has always changed, but the second is that it is changing in a way that is without precedent because of human intervention. So there's that history. There's the history of the monsoon itself, if you want to put it that way. The second layer is that there's a history of monsoon science. And I think that is another key theme in the book, which is to say, the nature of our knowledge of the monsoon has changed, again, quite sharply and quite starkly over the last 150 years or so. Some of this is about better data, but some of it is, of course, about advances in the understanding of the physics of the monsoon, the understanding of the ability to model the monsoon, the very patchy history of trying to forecast the monsoon. And one of the striking things about the monsoon is that it remains one of the most difficult global climatic phenomena to model. Global climate models tend to do quite badly when it comes to forecasting the monsoon because it's so complicated, because of the sort of multi-scalar influences upon it. And I think that is an interesting part of this history, that over the course of the 20th century, it became clear to climate scientists that the scale of the monsoon, in a sense, keeps expanding. So initially, by the end of the 19th century, you have some British colonial meteorologists in India thinking the Himalayas are really central to this. So that's the first intuition. But by the 1920s and 1930s, and the work in particular of someone called Gilbert Walker, who was actually very influential even in our understanding of global climate, he was the first pretty much to describe what we now call the El Nino Southern Oscillation, even though he wasn't quite sure what the mechanism was underlying it. He could see that the monsoon was, yes, it was very much sort of influenced by the topography and by the Himalayas, but that it was actually connected to global climate in multiple ways, including what we now call the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So he was very interested in correlating, for example, monsoon failure with what's going on in Australia in particular and other parts of the Pacific world. You start to see the monsoon is really quite central to the global climatic system. So there's that history. And then finally, there's the everyday history of the monsoon, which is what you alluded to in the beginning with your question. There's the history of how the monsoon has shaped everyday life. And that's not a linear history. That's not even a very easy history to periodize. Neither is it unchanging. I think that's just a very much more gradual kind of history, which is to say that there are moments when people are aware that the climate is changing, or that the monsoon is behaving in an unexpected way. And sometimes that is attributed to supernatural influence. Sometimes that is attributed to political failures. Sometimes that is attributed to climatology and meteorology. So I feel like there's a different kind of history. And that kind of history, I think, is something that anthropologists are probably better equipped to really get down into the texture of that, which is to say, how does everyday knowledge of the monsoon change? Not the climate scientists or the meteorologists' knowledge of the monsoon or the state's knowledge of the monsoon, but people's knowledge of the monsoon. And I think that's a profoundly local history. That would vary from site to site across the entirety of the Indian subcontinent and indeed much of Southeast Asia as well.
We'll be back after a break. Thank you so much, Sunil. Really fascinating. And I like the way you talk about these different kinds of histories. And not just different kinds of history, but different ways of looking at the monsoon through its natural history, through monsoon science, through everyday history. In the book, you do speak a lot about farming and agrarian systems. But you also speak about other things that started during the British Empire and then continued post-independence, which is how we continue to dam our waters. Damming in India actually has such an old history. And then, of course, post-independence, the way groundwater then transforms our relationship to water in India. And increasingly our water tables have diminished, they're contaminated. I'm just curious to hear from you a little bit about how you see this relationship between the past, and then now this increasingly scary present and even scarier future that we could foresee.
So Isabel Hofmeyr, wonderful historian and literary scholar based in South Africa, who's written a lot about the Indian Ocean. Over the last few years, she's come up with this wonderful term, which I find very resonant. She talks about hydrocolonialism. And I think what I like about it is it's multifaceted. It's conquest by means of water, which is to say that, of course, European empires came to Asia by sea, but it's also about the conquest of water in the sense of water as a pathway to wealth. I feel that sort of captures nicely in just one word some of the deep histories that I think we're still grappling with the legacies of. Over the course of the 20th century, I feel like what's really striking is how much continuity there is. How much continuity there is between a kind of late colonial emphasis on the control of water to bring about agricultural productivity and a post-colonial approach to water that has actually differed very little from that. And many have commented on this over time. Rohan D'Souza, in his great book on dams in Eastern India, he talks about kind of colonial, what he calls supply-side hydrology, which is to say an exclusive focus almost on the quantity of water that is available to irrigate land, and how this blinded policymakers, I think, to other ways of thinking about watery landscapes, other ways of thinking about using water, other ways of thinking about sustainable agricultural practices. But to go back to your sort of bigger question about how that history shapes us still, I mean, in a sense, the multiple, and I agree with you, scary crises that we face now are a residue of such an accumulated set of histories, and some of that history is embedded in infrastructure. I mean, I think that's one of the ways we can think about it, that the infrastructure with which water is controlled in most modern states, not just in South Asia, but really all over the world, is a product of a particular set of ideas and imaginations and designs that circulated globally, that were often with roots mostly in the late 19th and early 20th century, and which have proved very sticky in many ways, which have proved very attractive long after many of their negative consequences have come to be known. And one of the things that I think has been very clear in South Asia, and you see this in Pakistan as much as in India, particularly with the very severe flooding that Pakistan faced more than a decade ago, is the more heavily engineered the landscape, the greater the risk when patterns of rainfall, for example, are no longer consistent with historical patterns, or when river flow starts to change compared with the limits the engineers sort of were working within when they designed these. And we've seen repeated cases of dam failure, dam collapse, often with devastating consequences. And most projections are this will only become more intensive over time, which is to say that if there's one simple way to describe the 20th century approach, it's about the conquest of nature. It's about dominating and subduing nature. I think this is a project that has transcended some fundamental political transformations, which is to say that, despite the utterly fundamental political revolution that happens in India and across the region in the 1940s with the coming of political freedom, there are many of these other approaches to managing nature which shift very little. I mean, if anything, they then become sort of intensified also by US influence, by the politics of the Cold War and international development organizations, but also by a real sense that there is no alternative. And I think that's the way, maybe more than any other, that history continues to shape present crises, the sense that there is no alternative.
That's really fascinating. And you're right, especially post-independence, we're talking about nation building, and dams and all these big infrastructure projects become part of that imaginary. I'm also curious here, when you talked about Pakistan, you're just looking at the rise in temperatures right now in India and in Pakistan, and it's really quite terrifying. In your book, you speak a lot about famines and droughts, because that's so much part of our histories, especially during empire. I love the way you titled that chapter Parched Histories, because I think that's also a little prescient, because I think we might see some of those parched histories become parched futures. In your book, you talk about how climate started becoming kind of the heart of a new ecology of fear. And I wondered, given all the present changes that we're seeing relating to climate, especially in our coastal areas, etc., how do these historical readings or these parched histories, how do they equip us in being able to deal, let's say, with the new kinds of fears and anxieties that we will have to face in the coming decades?
Thank you, Susan. So ecology of fear is a wonderful phrase that comes from the title of a book by the great scholar Mike Davis, who also has written about 19th century famines in South Asia and across the global south. But that actually came from a book he wrote on California, and he was talking about the ecology of fear that has shaped the city of Los Angeles. I just found that idea so resonant. It's one that I sort of borrowed in thinking about the consequences of those late 19th century mega droughts and the famines that followed from them. When we talk about the monsoon, we tend immediately to think about rainfall. But the consequence of the monsoon for human life in South Asia is as often about the absence of rainfall, or the unevenness of rainfall, or the failure of rainfall to arrive, as it is its excess. And in terms of how those histories sort of equip us now, the first thing we should do, and I think we must do, is to point to a much more positive story, which is to say that political freedom in India pretty much broke the link between extended drought and large-scale starvation. That was a phenomenon of the colonial period, and very much, as so much historical scholarship has shown, a product of the colonial political economy and the priority of the colonial state to maximize its own revenue and security over the lives and livelihoods of Indians. So there's a fundamental shift that does happen in 1947. As we know, the post-independence Indian state has been much less good at tackling chronic problems of malnutrition. So the link between drought and famine, I think, is, and we hope very much that this is a permanent thing, was largely broken in 1947. But there are many other ways in which the risks that these parched histories or futures pose impinge in a very direct and visceral way on people's lives, including hunger, if not starvation. So I think there's a warning, in this earlier history of how devastating the consequences of drought have been when there has not been a responsible political order in place that takes the necessary measures to break the link between prolonged drought and starvation. We're seeing now, of course, is droughts that are becoming ever more difficult to predict, that are probably becoming more frequent, or certainly more severe when they occur. I think the data suggests they're not necessarily more frequent. They have been more severe on average, when they have occurred. And some droughts in parts of South Asia have been prolonged, and not just South Asia. Australia is another country that has suffered prolonged drought over the last decade or more in some places. So I think there's almost no question, given everything that climate scientists are telling us, that this is going to become more common. And I think what we need to do when we look to the histories of drought and dryness and the absence of rain in South Asia and elsewhere is it should be sobering for a start at how devastating these can be. But it should also, I hope, sort of strengthen the ways in which progress has been made since the middle of the 20th century in sort of bringing public food distribution systems, warning signs, public social security to sort of mitigate some of those consequences. I suppose the other thing that worries me, looking at the sort of long history, is one of the fundamental transformations in Indian agriculture in the 20th century, and the same thing has happened in other countries, the same is true in China, in fact, is that over the course of the 20th century, the most productive agricultural lands in India are actually the driest. And they have been made productive entirely by artificial irrigation. And for the most part, since the 1970s, they've been made productive. You mentioned groundwater extraction. They've been made productive by the massive, massive use of groundwater. I mean, India is the largest consumer of groundwater in the world. We know that's not sustainable. Satellite images show us that it is already not being sustained. And that's alarming when it comes to thinking about food security and the relationship between moisture, heat, and livelihoods.
Thank you so much, Sunil. And I know that you are writing a new book on environmental history, and I'm really curious, and I'm sure our listeners are too, in terms of what you're planning to explore in that one. And does water also feature in a big way in that book? And since publishing Unruly Waters, and you also talked about the previous book you wrote on the Bay of Bengal, what are some of the new insights that you've had since you've written that book? And maybe what has changed or what has surprised you, let's say, in the last couple of years?
So I am currently working on, I suppose it's a book on an even bigger scale. It's a global environmental history. And that comes from our shared knowledge, for a start, that we are dealing with a global or indeed a planetary crisis, but that the consequences of that crisis are very unevenly distributed. Which is to say that there are parts of the world, many of them in South Asia, that are very much at the front lines of climate change impact, alongside multiple other environmental crises. And of course, that those who are most vulnerable have done almost nothing to cause these problems in the first place. So there's a deep history of inequality embedded in what it means to say we face a global environmental crisis. So partly I'm writing a history of that, which is to say, how has global inequality, given rise to a global environmental crisis? And I'm writing it as a view that foregrounds the experience of India, Southeast Asia, China. A lot of global history still tends to begin with the North Atlantic world. And so partly the shift of perspective that comes here is, what does a global environmental history look like if we take India as a base, or Indonesia as a base, from which to understand the last couple of 100 years and how things have shifted. So in that sense, water will certainly be a major theme, both in terms of climate and in terms of oceans and rivers. But in terms of what has changed for me, that's a great question, because it's I've started to become much more interested in animal history. I've started to become much more interested in trees. In a way, Unruly Waters, despite the centrality of the monsoon, is still a very anthropocentric history, and I think the new book will be at some level that too. But I have been trying. I think that has been my big challenge. It's a challenge to the imagination as much as anything else, to think about the human and the non-human and how we're writing these histories, hopefully in a way that is a little bit more open and a little bit less exclusively concerned with human action or the consequences for human society of these transformations, which of course are affecting the entire living planet. And it's a journey I'm on. I had a very urban upbringing. I had no interest in nature growing up in the natural world. I was fundamentals, kind of a product of late 20th century Southeast Asian booming city, which is Singapore. And so this has been a very slow, really a 20-year-long personal journey as well as an intellectual one, to pay attention in a different way and to pay attention to more of the world, really.
That's so beautiful, Sunil. I'm really excited to see the next book. And it's interesting that you talk about this personal evolution, because I have found that in my own work, because I spent many decades as a lawyer and as a policymaker. And especially since I've sort of given all of that up, I have found myself thinking more and more about our relationship to other species. And I've loved some of the work that I've been reading recently about kinship in particular. Kinship with water, kinship with other animals. And it's something that sort of really strikes a chord with me. So thank you for sharing this with us. If I may just sort of, end with your epilogue, which I loved, by the way, in the book, where you quote the unbelievable Zadie Smith, love her, where she says that there are hardly any intimate words, no words that capture the sense of loss that climate change brings with it. And I wondered whether there are some words that you can give our listeners, about the sense of loss, but maybe even about a sense of hope that we could maybe imagine. And what happens to our memories of place and landscape when we do lose it? And any other final messages that you have for our listeners?
Thank you so much, Susan. So yes, that was this wonderful piece Zadie Smith wrote in the New York Review of Books, pointing out something so fundamental that I think many people were intuitively aware of, but she put it as, with characteristic kind of insight and in a beautiful way, that we don't have intimate words to talk about climate and loss. And the sort of neologism, solastalgia, which is the sort of sense of loss that comes from the environment changing around you, which I think captures a lot of this. It's increasingly, I think there's work being done on climate and mental health and how, at that most intimate of levels, our sense of self is affected by these fundamental changes that are going on around us. Some of that research has been done with people who live in very, very northerly parts of the world, in Arctic communities, who have suffered a dramatic change in their landscapes. And it is a whole new vocabulary that I think is needed to understand that as a kind of trauma, as a kind of loss, as a kind of suffering. And there are other ways in which I think there are different vocabularies to think about both what we are experiencing, but also perhaps what we're losing. There was a beautiful piece that was published in India Climate Dialogue by Mirza Zulfiqur Rahman, and it was titled The Many Names of Rain in the Eastern Himalayas. And it's extraordinary. There are such textured, specific ways to talk about different kinds of rain, location-specific rains. One form of rain, sort of the most thunderous and profusion of rain, is described as, the rain that chases the one-horned rhino versus the rain that chases the goats versus the rain that chases people. What will happen to all of these vocabularies as the rains change? That is something that's, I think, very much on my mind when I think about the land, because it's a loss of language as well as a loss of place. It's a loss of names. The great Mughal historian Irfan Habib published in the 1980s an atlas of the Mughal Empire. And it's not something you expect to be moving. It's an atlas. But there's amazing stuff in there about the changing course of rivers and the names of places that don't exist anymore, and how we might reconstruct those names, and whether anybody remembers those names. So I feel like there is a lot about our sense of place, the language that we have to describe that belonging that is in flux now. And it is that flux that, may need a word like solastalgia or any number of other words that, psychologists and psychiatrists are starting to think through, often turning to indigenous categories to understand what these kinds of shifts might mean. But there is hope in this too. People are fighting to preserve particular landscapes. People are fighting to preserve oral histories and memories. I know one of your podcasts is with a new archive of oral histories of the Narmada movement. I mean, I think there is a struggle against forgetting that is going on and proliferating in so many ways through so many different movements and through the work of both individuals and collectives to try to do something. You talked about kinship, and I was really struck by that. And there is more and more writing about our kinship with other species. There is, I've found in trying to think about animal history as I write this global environmental history, a history of care and kinship as much as there is, of course, a history of destruction and domination. And so in all of these things, there are seeds of inspiration, I think, in looking back to history, if not always, especially in the times we're living through right now, exactly what I'd call hope.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sunil. It's been absolutely wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I've loved this conversation.
Absolutely. And I really wish you all the best with the book. And do let us know when it's all ready so you can come back on.
I will. And do keep in touch. This has been really a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks to Sunil Amrith for sharing his thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.